So, we've come to the end of our long journey. And although we have touched on much, you might think much too much, we have had to leave still more untouched. Many other writers and topics could and perhaps should have been included, but that would have been to make what is an already very long series of lectures start to approach infinity, and that way madness lies. So let the journey we've taken together be a framework into which other themes and other topics, other thinkers can be inserted whenever the Spirit moves. Still, you might wonder why we should bother with so much old stuff. Who cares what Plato or Aristotle or John of Salisbury thought? Why should we read Baudin or Machiavelli or anyone before the 20th century for that matter? The short answer to that question is because the weak theory of history is not true. It is not the case that each day in every way things get better and better. Good ideas are not always taken up. Sometimes they're simply ignored or forgotten. Take Althusius's ideas on federation, on a Russian doll-like set of vertically arranged, interlocking, but detachable entities with sovereignty located in the base units. If those ideas had been adopted instead of Baudin's idea of sovereignty located in the ruler, this could well have given rise to a very different political history of the last 500 years. Similarly, the example of the polycentric legal orders of the Middle Ages shows us that many different modes of political and legal organization can coexist and interact and even compete, and so should encourage us to believe that as the present is different from the past, so too the future will be different from the present. But these ideas are not lost forever, and they can provide an inspiration for libertarians today, who can take from them whatever is acceptable and leave the rest behind. Sir Henry Maine is famous for contending that the development of society consists primarily in the move from status to contract, from societies ordered on the basis of who you are to societies ordered on the basis of what you can do. I echo this idea in my contention that the progress of liberty has largely consisted in the slow and imperfect transition from collectivism to individualism, from the primacy of the tribe or the group or the collective to the primacy of the individual person. Such a transition is neither automatic nor complete, nor are relapses impossible. The lure of the collective exercises a perennial magnetic attraction for the human spirit. Fascism, Bolshevism, and Nazism were all of them a return to tribalism in one form or another. Many aspects of our current welfare states embody tribalist impulses. It would seem that early man tended to see himself as a member of the tribe first, and as an individual second, if at all. Certainly, when we come to look at our early history, we can see that the ancient Greeks tended to take the polis to be the primary reality, and to see the individuals of which it was composed to be somehow secondary. The Sophists were perhaps the first thinkers to offer a serious challenge to this conception, even if that challenge was not immediately successful. The formation of Europe is often seen to be the blending of Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christianity into a new and potent socio-political religious brew. And so, in many ways, it was. But what is often forgotten is the contribution made by the political practices of the barbarian tribes. The 9th century inherited the Roman and patristic teaching on the divine source of secular authority, and the corresponding obligation on Christians to offer no resistance to their rulers and to obey them in all things, save a direct command to violate God's laws. But this inherited tradition came into sharp conflict with the indigenous beliefs and practices of the Germanic tribes, one significant aspect of which was that the authority of rulers was limited and the obligation of obedience to that authority conditional. The clash between these two theoretical tectonic plates is the source of much of the apparently confused political discussions and political practices, not only of this period, but also of the following centuries. The traditions of the Germanic tribes were innocent of any subscription to the theory of unlimited and absolute obedience to one's rulers. As Carlyle remarks, the Germanic tradition knew nothing of an unlimited authority in the ruler, but a great deal of the relation of the king to his great or wise men, and even to the nation as a whole. For the 9th century thinkers, the law was the law of the community, and the king, as part of the community, was as bound by that law as anyone else. The law was not a matter of the king's will. So far as laws have been made, they proceed from the whole state. They have, says Carlyle, been made with the general consent of the faithful subjects of the king. The king does not make laws by his own authority, but requires the consent and advice of his wise men, and, in some more or less vague sense, of the whole nation. Again, in the 9th century, kings came to be kings by a process that, to us, appears confused. The process combined elements of divine sanction, election, and hereditary succession, elements that might well appear to us to be incompatible and even contradictory, but which seemed perfectly in order to the people of that time. The element of election in this process is of great interest to those of us keeping an eye on liberty. Perhaps of even greater interest is that in this process of election there was a mutual exchange of promises between kings and people, or at least between king and the great men in the land. This makes the kingly appointment both contractual and conditional. Christianity is another very important contributor to the eventual emancipation of the individual from the group, fitful as that emancipation may have been. Although Christianity made no immediate impact on its social and political surroundings, it contributed to the emancipation of the individual in two ways. First, in its idea of man as imago Dei, as a being made in the image and likeness of God, and that is an absolutely free and unconstrained God. It gave a dignity to the human individual that he rarely, if ever, had had before, even if, in reality, that dignity was honoured more in the breach than in the observance. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the Church eventually came to constitute a rival institution to any and all political regimes. As the Western world began to settle down after the fall of Rome, there would be not one but two loci of authority, no one of which would have a complete claim to the total allegiance of the individual. In the space created by the tension between the regnum and the sacerdotium, a space was created which permitted freedom to flourish. This freedom took concrete form in the High Middle Ages, in the emergence of commerce, technology, the cities, and the universities, all of these institutions and practices forming the social spine of a world that is recognizably modern and is still with us today. The fracturing of Christendom, resulting from the Reformation, coincided with the beginnings of the modern state. It could be argued that the rise of the modern state contributed to this fracturing, or that the fracturing of Christendom contributed to the rise of the state. In fact, it is likely that the chain of causation was reciprocal. In the new states, Protestant and Catholic alike, the Church was in almost every case subordinated to the state's political purposes, no longer able to provide significant opposition to the emerging centralization of political power and its extension into ever-increasing areas of human life. So dominant is this new dispensation of the centrality and necessity of the state that it is practically impossible for us to imagine that things could ever have been or could ever be different. In political philosophy, the question is always, what is the best kind of state? Never the more basic question, is the state either necessary or desirable? Liberty is a very important matter, but it is not the only important matter. There is more to life than liberty, just as there are more interesting things to eat and drink than bread and water. Murray Rothbard, whose credentials as a libertarian none can doubt, remarked that only an imbecile could ever hold that freedom is the highest, or indeed the only principle or end of life. For him, such a claim is scarcely coherent or meaningful. He agreed with Lord Acton that freedom is the highest political end, not the highest end of man per se. Liberty is the foundation stone of any and all acceptable social orders, but liberty by itself doesn't determine whether any of these orders is otherwise desirable. One can be a libertarian and a libertine, caring nothing for the lives of others. Or one can use one's liberty in cooperation with others to promote human flourishing. The choice is yours. I repeat some points that I made in the lectures because they may have got lost in the massive words I have inflicted on you. It cannot be too heavily emphasized that the limited, although potent scope of libertarianism is not intended to deny the importance of love, community, discipline, order, learning, or any of the many other values that are essential to human flourishing. Libertarians, as much as anyone else, can cherish these values, but however much they might cherish them, they reject any and all attempts to produce and maintain them by force, coercion, or intimidation. They regard such attempts at coercion as both wrong in themselves and as ineffective. As Tibor Mackin puts it, force is permissible and useful only in repelling force, not in building character, love, faith, scientific knowledge, and so on. In the end, as Rothbard notes, the question for the libertarian is this: should virtuous action, however we define it, be compelled, or should it be left up to the free and voluntary choice of the individual? No third road is possible here. One must choose compulsion or liberty. Misunderstandings can arise from a failure to recognize the severely limited scope of libertarianism. It is not intended to be, nor is it, a complete ethical political system. It is rather an overarching constraint on any such system. Libertarianism doesn't imply that all modes of conduct are equally valuable or have equal merit. There may well be those who think of themselves as libertarians who believe this, but such a view, despite Kirk's assertion that liberty descends into a maelstrom of license, is not a necessary consequence of libertarianism. A libertarian may choose to be a libertine, but there is nothing in libertarianism to constrain him to be one. Tibor Mackin again asks, is libertinism implicit in the advocacy of liberty as the highest political principle? And he answers resoundingly, no. Libertarianism only prohibits the forcible squelching of indecent conduct, not its vigorous criticism, opposition, boycott, or denunciation in peaceful ways. Libertarianism is compatible with a whole variety of ethical positions. Any system of morality or politics that does not infringe upon individual liberty is acceptable to libertarianism. Any system that infringes upon individual liberty is not. Libertarians are sometimes portrayed as if they necessarily considered social disorder to be something desirable. Nothing could be further from the truth. While there may be individual libertarians who, bizarrely, judge that a disordered Hobbesian state of nature is a consummation devoutly to be wished, most libertarians desire to live in an ordered society. The question is not whether order is desirable, it is what kind of order is desirable and where that order is to come from. For the libertarian, as for Johannes Althusius, genuine order arises intrinsically from the free interaction among individuals and among groups of individuals. It does not descend extrinsically from on high. As is clearly shown in the world of business, high-level order can emerge without an orderer. Each individual consumer, each firm, orders its own affairs and the relations it has with others. And out of this nexus of relationships emerges a higher level order that is not the design of any one person. No one person or agency, for example, is required to organize the production, transport, distribution, and sale of food in a given country. Food producers, transport firms, wholesalers, and retailers, each working to their own ends, produce an ordered and flexible outcome that is not planned by any one person or agency. Robert Nisbet claims that for libertarians, individual freedom in almost every conceivable domain is the highest of all social values, and is so irrespective of what forms and levels of moral, aesthetic, and spiritual debasement may prove to be the unintended consequence of such freedom. On the contrary, I should say that for libertarians, liberty is the lowest of social values, lowest in the sense of most fundamental, a sine qua non of a human actions being susceptible of moral evaluation in any way at all. Libertarians are free to take a variety of positions towards the significance of custom, habit, and tradition. Nothing in libertarianism as such mandates a particular stance. While some libertarians adopt a hostile attitude towards custom, habit, and tradition, and in particular towards religious traditions, this was not the position of Murray Rothbard, the preeminent libertarian of the latter half of the 20th century. In an essay on Frank Meyer, who sought to fuse the conservatives' reverence for tradition with the libertarians' love of liberty, Rothbard wrote that custom must be voluntarily upheld and not enforced by coercion, and that people would be well advised, although not forced, to begin with a presumption in favour of custom. If it is granted that one should not be coerced into observing customs or traditions. Rothbard, for one, was more than happy to go along with much of conservative thought. In a late essay, he called his fellow libertarians to order, remarking that libertarians often mistakenly assume that individuals are bound to each other only by the nexus of market exchange, forgetting that everyone is necessarily born into a family, and one or several overlapping communities, usually including an ethnic group, with specific values, cultures, religious beliefs, and traditions. One can be a political libertarian and a cultural conservative. The libertarian relies on a sharp distinction between the realm of morality and the realm of legality. Legality is determined by considerations of justice, and justice in turn is a function of non-aggression. Whatever is done, provided it involves no aggression or threat of aggression, is ipso facto just. It is not, however, ipso facto moral. Rothbard distinguishes emphatically between a man's right and the morality or immorality of his exercise of that right. The possession of a right is one thing, its exercise is quite another. The moral or immoral ways of exercising that right is a question of personal ethics rather than of political philosophy, whereas political philosophy is concerned solely with matters of right and of the proper or improper exercise of physical violence in human relations. It can hardly be said too often or too bluntly that, despite the suspicions of such as Kirk, libertarianism is not the same thing as libertinism. Libertarianism will not admit the physical restraint or physical punishment of acts that do not aggress against others, but it nowhere implies moral approval of such acts or rules out their restraint by other methods. A libertarianism disconnected from the customs and traditions dear to conservatism runs the risk of becoming a mere fleshless skeleton. Libertarian thought is basically premised on the appropriate contractual or consensual relationships that should obtain between adult human beings existing at the same time, that is, synchronically or intragenerationally, in relation to their property in themselves and in external resources. For the most part, what is not explicitly considered in libertarian thought is the intergenerational aspect of relationships, between those who are complete self-owners and those who are not yet so, between parents and children. This relationship is diachronic rather than synchronic, and is based not on contract but on status. What should be a libertarian's approach to social order? One cannot be prescriptive here. As long as one respects the primacy of liberty in matters of non-aggression, one is a libertarian. Whatever else one may wish to commit to is a matter of indifference to the libertarian as a libertarian. I believe that a civilized existence requires both freedom and order, that just as a sound economy requires capital which is produced by saving and by delayed gratification, so too cultural capital is similarly produced by delayed gratification. Freedom without order is like a sudden release of energy, pointless and destructive. Order without freedom is a lifeless corpse. Freedom and order together produce a living, vital society. We are constituted in large part by things outside our range of choices. Our language, our family, our locality, all these are simply given to us, whether we will or no. In their focus on that which is simply given to us, handed on to us, whole and entire, on tradition, conservatives are onto something important, which, however, may not have quite the significance they attribute to it. It is true that much of what we are is simply given to us, and is not a matter of choice. The family we belong to, the nation we conceive of as ours, the language we speak, the way we speak it, indeed many of our ideas, all these are important, perhaps constitutive parts of what we are, parts of our very identity, if you will, and yet not a matter of choice. In all these matters we are in what Henry Maine would call the realm of status, not contract. Yet, despite being constitutive of our identities, tradition can have, at best, a heuristic rather than a normative function. For however much something has been done, for however long, and by however many, questions can always be asked. Is this right? Is this good? Is this the best? And these questions subvert any ultimate normative claim that tradition can make. Does a libertarian have to deny any of this? I don't think so. And a libertarian can accept with Rothbard the presumptive legitimacy of existing social structures, but without conceding any necessarily inviolable status to them. A libertarian can be a gradualist in respect of necessary or desirable changes, albeit a rapid gradualist, and that's not a contradiction in terms. Such is the complexity of existing institutions that any immediate or radical change is likely to be wildly destructive and perhaps even inimical to a coherent and improved restructuring. Edmund Burke thought that manners mattered more than law, and even more than morals, inasmuch as both law and morals in large measure depend upon manners. In his first letter on a regicide peace, he wrote, "Manners are of more importance than laws. Upon them, in a great measure, the laws depend. The law touches us but here and there, and now and then. Manners are what vex or soothe, corrupt or purify, exalt or debase, barbarize or refine us, by a constant, steady, uniform, insensible operation, like that of the air we breathe in. They give their whole form and colour to our lives. According to their quality, they aid morals, they supply them, or they totally destroy them." I find myself in substantial agreement with Burke on this point. If we take, as is I think not unreasonable, manners to encompass all that is customary in society, then law and morals are phenomena emergent from such custom. We do not produce and maintain our manners primarily by some process of detached reason. They arise naturally in the context of social relations. Such judgments as they embody is a kind of pre-reflective judgment, what Burke calls prejudice. Manners as prejudices allow us to act swiftly and surely and rightly without the need for agonized reflection and reasoning. At the root of manners is the notion of restraint, of limitation, of delayed gratification, and its product is a kind of social capital, just as the product of physical delayed gratification and restraint is economic capital. Burke contrasts this form of ordered liberty with mere license, which is the freedom to do whatever one wants to do without regard to circumstances. Now, libertarianism is compatible with both Burkean liberty or with Burkean license. A libertarian can arrive at substantially the same conclusions as Burke, with this difference, that the restraints and limitations that channel our exercise of liberty must, with the exception of the restraint of actions aggressing against others, be self-imposed, self-accepted, and not imposed by the coercive power of the law. Just how close the Burkean position is to that of a culturally conservative libertarian should be evident from that seminal passage on manners I just quoted from the Letters on a Regicide Peace. Once this matter is settled, then of course one is free to contract with others in any way that one chooses, including an association of property owners with delegated powers to a ruler if that is one's choice. There are a lot of possibilities here. One could choose a ruler and, in a Hobbesian style, allow the ruler to make and unmake laws as he chooses. One could adopt a constitution and within that allow a ruler free reign, and so on. Everything is possible, as long as the root principle of liberty is respected.